Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of About Time with me, Chris Nichols. This is where I get to talk to old friends and colleagues and people who've influenced and inspired me over the years. And I am delighted that a very old friend and colleague, Megan Reitz, is here. Megan, hello and welcome.
It's lovely to see you, Chris. I've been looking forward to this.
Great. So, I mean, I'm imagining that most people who follow my podcast will know who you are, but for people who don't, I mean, how do you introduce yourself these days?
It depends on where I'm at and who I'm with and how I'd like to connect and the impact of the labels that I use. As you know, that's a big part of my research. The first label that pops into my head is a mum. And I'm a mum of two teenage daughters. And as I mentioned to you just before this call, we're heading on a long flight tomorrow, and one of them's already got an ear infection on cue. So being a mum is probably the most figural right now. If I'm looking to give you my sort of professional titles, I am an associate fellow now at Oxford Said Business School, and I'm a professor of leadership and dialogue at Ashridge, part of Holt International Business School. So those two are my kind of other
Right.
titles, I suppose.
Yeah. But I mean, you write, don't you? I mean, you write loads of stuff and you do all kinds of talks and yeah.
Yes.
You're one of my guests on here who's close to being a rock star.
Oh God. Okay. Yeah, no, I don't think my kids would probably make that connection between me and a rock star. But yeah, so I have written a lot, always, nearly always with others.
Yeah.
And Michael Chaskalson and John Higgins in particular. And yeah, I do a lot of
Yeah.
sort of conference work and speaking, but also quite a bit of facilitation and action research, action inquiry. So there's quite a broad span of everything from your kind of standing on stage and trying to summarize my research in 15 minutes, right the way through to much longer term consulting projects, I suppose, which are looking to change organizational culture.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was thinking when we first met, because it's quite a while, and it was at Ashridge in like 20
2000 and,
years ago or something.
yeah,
Was that
2006. Yeah, 2000
was
2006.
it?
I joined
Yeah.
Ashridge in February 2006. And I believe you were running the very first program that I did anything on. And I think it might have been civil service. And I was allowed to do a change management session. I remember being utterly terrified, but you and a few other colleagues there held me very well in that moment, and yeah, rest is history.
Yeah. Uh, I have I have no memory at all of which program it was, but I do remember working with you a lot for
Yes,
years and years, particularly on the simulation, which became our kind of our shared gig. But you were
absolutely.
program director for something called Leading on the Edge, which was the Ashridge simulation, which was a brilliant thing. Yeah.
Yes, it was
And
a fabulous simulation developed by colleagues, including Eve Paul. And she was absolutely amazing and brought me into that program. And then, yes, as you said, I program directed it. I did every single one I possibly could with you on as a faculty member because and you were utterly figural in my development through the years at Ashridge, particularly in the realms of, interest in power, in uncertainty, in conflict. I don't know that you know the very, very figural role that you played actually for me there.
Lovely. Well, thank you. It's so nice of you to say, Megan. Was there anything else you wanted to say about the simulation?
I think um, I think the most important thing to say is that my memory from the simulation is, as you and I recall, anything could happen in the simulation.
Really?
And at any point, there could be a massive bust up and all sorts of things would happen. And you, to me, seemed completely calm. In fact, more than that, you almost loved it in the sense of became incredibly curious when things became really uncertain and when it was getting really tough, actually, you moved towards it. Whereas inside me at the time, I remember being terrified on more than a few occasions on that simulation, because I just thought, oh my goodness, I don't know where this is going. I can't control this. What if nobody, what if people don't learn from this? What if it all goes wrong? What if they walk out, which they did sometimes? And you seem to just be like, excellent, now we're going to start learning, and being alongside that for years really, really helped me to become more comfortable in situations of uncertainty, um, and to be more comfortable in situations of conflict. And I think, the way I kind of grew up, I wasn't very comfortable with either, and it's such an important part of my work now, is to be able to show up in, quite dysfunctional situations where I can't solve anything. I don't know the answer. I can't predict and control it. And so I think that, to me, that was one of the most important things about that simulation and working alongside you, was that gradual capacity to expand my comfort zone and become more and more comfortable in those uncertain, challenging moments.
Mm, yeah, and I think we made a great team.
Mm,
We were a great team doing it, and as you said, we whenever we could, we ran it together,
mm,
and yeah, and it was a huge learning edge for me too. I mean, it was one of the best things I've ever done anywhere ever.
mm.
Yeah, and it was marvelous, and and I think it still goes on, which is brilliant. That people are still benefiting from that simulation years on, which is terrific. Yeah, but
Absolutely.
you, yeah, I mean, for me, the thing that brought me into it, um, apart from the fact that even you asked me to to get involved, was I did my masters, the AMOC Masters in Complexity, and I'd already done my psychotherapy training at psychosynthesis. So I'd spent an awful lot of time sitting quietly in circles, wondering what the hell is happening here. So in some ways, the simulation was just more of the same, and yeah, it did feel quite. By that stage, it felt like not familiar because it was never familiar, but it was a place that I was accustomed to. I knew
Yeah.
how to work in it. Yeah.
And I think, now a lot of my research is around how leaders show up and the impact that they then have on others. And you showed up in a way that uh, was full of curiosity. And as I said, sort of moving towards in a situation of uncertainty. And it had a huge impact on me. And I think that, it can be mirrored in some of the work that I do now with leaders and the impact that they have. Their state, if you like, is contagious for the people that are around them. And it makes a huge amount of difference if you meet a leader that is curious and inquiring in a situation of uncertainty, rather than one that is trying to control and predict and narrow attention. So yes, it mirrors nicely to that.
Yeah, and I was reading a piece I don't know if it was an article or a blog or something, from Chris Moles, who's Professor of Complexity at Hertfordshire, took over from Ralph Stacey. And he was talking about the dangers of facilitation and how facilitators quite often want to control and contain and put things back into a plan. And I thought, gosh, Chris, we've obviously not seen some of the stuff that we used to do at Ashridge,
Yeah.
because it is possible to have very different facilitation to the stuff he was talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's still hugely
Mm.
unusual. It is still, a facilitator's job generally is to try and control everything and keep it all on time and follow the agenda and predict outcomes and come to certainty. Or at least that's the performative expectations
Yeah.
of facilitators. And it is, I have to remind myself, having had 20 years of that sort of practice, I have to remind myself it's still very unusual for many people to allow and open up to that kind of uncertainty together as a team. It can be really scary.
Yeah. Yeah. It's really useful to be reminded that it's unusual.
Mm.
Yeah. Mm. So somewhere in this, apart from going off to have the first kiddie because I was your maternity cover on the program, but you also went off to do a doctorate. When was that?
I think that was probably about 2010. Yes, indeed. In fact, it was 2009. I began it between the two kids, and under the utterly superb supervision of Donna Ladkin.
Donna
Um,
Ladkin, yeah.
who has just been instrumental in my life. And my PhD it ended up examining dialogue and what we actually mean by dialogue, and a much more in-depth examination of dialogue than conversation. What does it mean to really meet one another? What does it really mean to turn one's attention fully to another? What is that experience like? And why is it so rare, particularly in workplace settings? My PhD brought in the work of Martin Buber, and it followed a cooperative inquiry action research approach. That set up actually the two projects that I then have been working on really for the last 10 years.
Yeah. So for folks who know nothing about this, and I'm only like a beginner in some of this. I mean, can you say something about Martin Buber and what was the influence of Martin Buber on your work?
So I'd done a master's degree, and done a dissertation on something that I had coined empathic resonance. So I was really interested, particularly in coaching, those moments, I suppose you could call those moments of flow, those moments of extremely extraordinary deep connection with others. And so I brought that into my PhD, but I only had my term, empathic resonance, and I couldn't find that anywhere else. What I did do when I did literature search on things like, flow experiences, resonance, is I came across the whole field of dialogue. And Martin Buber, a philosopher, is probably one of along with David Bohm and a few others, is probably one of the really figural authors and thinkers in the field of dialogue. And Martin Buber looked at two ways of encountering the world. He spoke about I and thou and I and it. And essentially he said that we can encounter one another and the environment and God. In fact, he's a very spiritual man. He said we can encounter that in an I-it instrumental manner, where we see one another as separate, we tend to be focused on what we want from a particular relationship, goal kind of orientated. And that is, importantly, necessary. It's necessary for survival to think in that kind of way. But he said all real living is meeting. All real human experience lies in our capacity for I-thou encounter, which is when we encounter one another in mutuality and we understand how deeply and utterly connected and interdependent we are. And we turn our full attention to that. Now, in that mode of encountering the world and the environment and others, we make very different choices. And we have incredibly different sorts of conversations. And obviously now going into my work in organizational spaces, we are superb at the instrumental and the I-it. And as Buber would say, there's nothing wrong with I-it, but if that's all you know, then we're in a pretty disastrous situation. And we forget how to live, and we forget how to experience joy. We forget to understand how intimately connected we are. So that's Martin Buber's work, and his work's very, very poetic, which is another way of saying it's quite difficult to understand. But I keep circling back to his work again and again and kind of going, oh, right, I see. I sort of understand his work differently every year. He's played a big role in the research that I'm doing with John right now in terms of spaciousness.
Yeah, gosh, we had a conversation. I had a conversation just the other day with Elizabeth McManus, who is a Zen practitioner and contemplative. She describes herself essentially as creative contemplative. And what you're describing here was completely at the heart of what Elizabeth was talking about. From a Zen point of view, not a Martin Buber point of view, but it's the same meeting. And an awful lot of a lot of the conversations we've been having on this series have been about the fundamental myth of separation between an individual human and the rest of the living world, all the life systems of which we're part, and how that relates to the catastrophe of the ecosystem that we're facing at the moment. And until you spoke there, I hadn't quite made the Buber connection that do a lot of people pick up on Buber explicitly in sort of ecological fields?
Possibly, but he's not as, I suppose, broadly well known as some other philosophers, and I think that is partly because it's difficult to get into his work. But I understand that more now, having done some research on spaciousness. We are looking at experiences that are beyond words, and so obviously he's turned to what we might call presentational knowing or poetic ways of describing things that had no other way of being conveyed. And that means that particularly if you came to his work with a bit of a, organizational workplace, right, what should we do? Where's Buber's top 5 tips? You'd probably be disappointed. It requires much more sitting with, pondering, contemplating, taking on a walk and going, I wonder whether he meant, maybe he meant, let me see. It requires a lot of that sort of work. And ironically, many of us that are in the instrumental world just don't have time to engage in it.
Yeah. It would be, we could explore so much of your work with Michael, your work with John, but maybe how about talking a bit about the now, the spaciousness stuff, because that feels is both current for you, but so important for what's going on in the world. I mean,
Yeah.
where are you with the work? Yeah.
Probably right at the beginning. Not that I think that there's an end of it. It is
Yeah.
probably relevant to say that during the PhD, there were two particular areas that really interested me when I was looking at dialogue, and they formed chapters in my PhD and then the book that was my PhD. And one of the chapters was on power and how our understanding of status and authority gets in the way of our meeting one another, because we're labeling one another, we're distancing one another, we're stereotyping, we're not seeing the person that's in front of us. So I was really interested in that. And another chapter was on presence and our capacity to pay attention to the other and keep paying attention to the other in the present moment. Despite our inner narrative and our inner dialogue very often jumping around and taking us somewhere else. So what happened was, after the PhD, I ended up doing essentially a big research project in both of those areas. In terms of the presence, I did a project with Michael Chaskalson called The Mindful Leader. So that was examining the attention and how might we be present with one another, and can you train that? And then the other project was with John Higgins called Speaking Truth to Power, which was what happens when you have power and labels. How does that impact the way that we can have conversations? And funnily enough, these two projects sort of went off separately, starting in about 2015. And it was only really a few years ago when I was like, oh, they're actually the same thing. They're actually crossing over. And what I became very interested in both projects is, how do we create the conditions and the space to have the conversations that matter at work, particularly when we're what we call pathologically busy. So how can you turn up and really listen and really see the other in these systems that are so fast paced, that are so focused on the instrumental goal at hand? And if there was one, doing lots of work on psychological safety with many organizations, if there was one, I suppose, excuse that kept on coming back with organizations that hadn't really got round to doing anything different, they'd very often say, we're just too busy. I'm just so busy. Yes, I loved that leadership program, but oh geez, we've just been so busy. I haven't been able to create the space. And there was a very figural moment. Again, I'm using that word a lot, aren't I? There was a very important moment about 5 years ago, possibly, I think pre-COVID, when I was doing work with a big organization, global organization, on psychological safety. And it got to the point where I had to write the report for the sponsor at the end of the program, as you do. And a lot of people in this organization had really put their heart and soul into it. We'd spent many, many hours in inquiry groups. We had phenomenal data about the culture. And it was now my job to try and convey that to sponsors that hadn't really been involved in the process. And you've had to do this numerous times as well, I'm sure, Chris. And I was sat there with a blank piece of paper, so to speak, on my computer. And I had the words executive summary at the top. And it was a moment I'll never forget. I felt almost bowled over by, should I call it despair? I guess just all of the energy left me, because I thought, you know what, they're not going to read this. I don't think they're going to. We've got all this amazing data. We've got all this amazing enthusiasm from amazing people. And it's just going to be another report that disappears into the system of bureaucracy. Right. And I wrote the first sentence, I can't remember it precisely, but the first sentence of the executive summary of this report is something like, you're probably not going to read this. So I think that was the moment where I thought, what the hell is going on with this absurd practice and performative work that we're doing in organizations, where we say something's really important to us, and it is, and yet then we're somehow not creating the space to do what we then need to. What is going on? Because I'm working with lots of people that really do care. It's not that they don't care. It's just that something's happening that means that they're not creating that space or prioritizing that space. And that's what kicked off the work with John. And it was a natural move from the work that we've done on activism as well, as, you know, how do you hear voices of difference? How do you create the space to have dialogue? Right now, we've done cooperative inquiry with lots and lots of people. We've done a lot of interviews. We're doing some absolutely gorgeous research right now with people that have nominated colleagues that they've worked with in their careers. And they've nominated people that are very successful in what we call the doing mode. You know, they're brilliant at achieving all the tangible targets that you have to do to stay in an organization. But they're also fabulous at somehow being able to create space for themselves and others to make wise choices and to see the broader perspective, to be more creative, to be more innovative, to be more relational. So I'm really interested in these people that can have a profound impact on others. As I said, they're very successful by sort of traditional tangible targets terms, but they also create and open up space, even when they're in systems that are excellent at disappearing those spaces. So we're doing that inquiry work now. And we are also just about to begin a book, which is an interesting exercise of spaciousness as it is, you know, that moment where you haven't written a word yet and you know that something is going to be created, but you just don't know what it looks like at the moment. And it sort of balances on the one side that slight terror of, oh my God, what if this is a particularly difficult thing to write about, I think. And will I do it justice? But on the other hand, being ever so excited at working with John to figure out what is it that we've actually found out? What do we know? And importantly, how do we create the methods whereby we can invite other people into that inquiry and experience and it can actually be useful? So it's just such a fascinating research project full of paradox, because we're talking about this expansive attention, and yet we're trying to also serve the classic instrumental doing desire to know how to do it quickly in 5 quick steps.
Well, I think this is so, as you say, so juicy and so important, because, you know, if I think about how I do it, and I do make, you know, hold open lots of space in lots of different ways, in lots of different forums, but a place I learned to do it was in the psychotherapy circle, which is very much not the hurly-burly, fast doing world. I went somewhere else to learn it, and then I learned how to bring it into these other spaces. And in my moment of, you know, probably deepest despair and crisis, after I left Ashridge, I went for a very long walk. You know, so my way of I absolutely needed to make space. I made space by doing something very much unrelated to the corporate doing world. I had no clue how to do that where I was at that
And
time.
can I just ask you, Chris, when you said you made space, can you go one level down from it? What do you mean? What do you mean when you said you made space or needed space?
Right. Are you talking about the long story when I left Ashridge? Yeah.
What was
I was
space for
going.
you?
I needed to be. I needed a change of environment from where, I mean, essentially, I had lost my faith in both organizations and the work I was doing because I thought, gosh, if it can come tumbling down in a way it just has, is it worth anything?
Mm,
Is is this complexity dialogic work I've been doing worth doing when it can be destroyed in a moment? Is it so fragile that it can
mm,
just be disappeared?
mm,
And I completely lost faith, and I I knew I was going to continue to work, but I couldn't just start again as game shift
mm,
without creating a little bit of distance from somewhere where I could compost my emotions
mm,
so I didn't go straight into game shift carrying the despair and anger. And I actually took
mm,
nearly 100 days of walking,
mm,
and I walked in silence. Um, and I noticed things about myself, which I didn't want to notice, um, that I would not have noticed if I'd been in a more urgent space, I think.
mm,
Yeah.
mm. Yeah. So you were able to, over time, I suppose Michael and I might call it kind of a meta awareness, that capacity over time to almost be able to observe with a little bit of curiosity. Sounds quite painful as well, but that ability to
Mm.
kind of go, okay, what sorts of things am I stuck in? What am I thinking? How am I feeling? And giving it the space to be able to really acknowledge and allow that, and then
Yeah.
that enabling you to enter into something else less
Yeah.
preoccupied and your mind less
Yeah.
busy with those old anxieties.
Yeah. Yeah. I was on an earlier episode, I was talking about this with John Higgins,
Mm,
and I was describing how I set off on that walk with a plan because I thought, well, if I'm going to do this walk to create some separation, I might as well write a book, or so I'll walk with some different people along different stages of it, and I'll write chapters of conversations on this walk. Uh, but I thought I'd give myself a week first just to get some of the walk into my legs because it's a 600 odd mile walk. Um, and after about 3 days, and I had this surreal, just or spiritual anyway, experience of the path not wanting me to have those conversations. It just insisted on being done in silence. And I just started to notice things that I would have
mm,
not noticed at all if I'd carried on with the plan.
mm,
Um, and I just started to notice things about my own reaction to, I found myself walking away from towns because I went through the towns quickly because I wanted to be in the open space, and the wilder the better, and the wilder the weather the better. Uh,
mm,
and I think that was part of my just wanting to get away from humanity for a bit.
mm,
But after a while, I started to notice good things,
mm.
lovely gestures of people on the path that, you know, only became obvious because I'd given them space and time to become obvious.
Mm. I
Yeah.
think
And I also,
the work,
yeah.
sorry. Oh no, I was going to say the work with Michael
Mm,
Chaskalson, we were very interested in the narrative mind, and that
yeah.
plays a big part in our spaciousness research as well. When we have a very noisy inner dialogue, particularly if it's wound up with fear and anxiety or depression or these sort of loops
Mm,
that keep our attention very narrow, and they have a huge impact, of course, on our body, and they have a huge
yeah.
impact on when we
Mm,
look out in the world what we see. And so part of spaciousness is acknowledging that and seeing that, and that's much harder than it sounds. And then the
no.
ability
Yeah.
to just gradually reduce the level of noise. And so, I'm really interested in the avoidance of those conversations, because the conversations would have, I guess, although they might have been very interesting, they would have added so much more noise again to the narrative mind, when it sounded like what you needed was to be able to give that mind a little bit of space to stretch and do its own
Yeah.
thing, rather than make it noisier than it
Yeah.
already was.
Yeah. And the other thing I noticed, Megan, was like when on the coast path, lots of days you've got a massive horizon, beautiful, endless scenery, just beautiful.
Mm,
They weren't the best days for it. The best days were when the mist came in and you couldn't see anything. You just hear the sea, but could barely see the path. And it absolutely forced me inwards. And to start with, I hated them. I absolutely hated those days because it forced the inner work.
mm,
Um, but after a while, yeah, the inner weather changed. But
mm,
it was it was like going on a 100-day retreat.
mm.
Um, yeah,
And many people need that kind of space at least once in their lives, and probably more than that. But of course, many of us are in systems where we don't have the space to notice what we need, and then of course don't have the conditions where we can kind of create that space, and that's when it ends up really dangerously. That's when we get very close to burnout.
yeah,
So again, it is the
mm,
spaciousness work feels really urgent. It feels like
yeah,
we're almost sucking the life out of our um our lives by not giving
yeah,
ourselves the kind of space that you're talking about. And because
yeah,
we're becoming so instrumental and so sort of pressured and narrow focused, it feels incredibly urgent to be able to,
yeah,
at least create some little bits more of space where we can make these wiser choices for ourselves and others.
yeah, yeah. And Megan, that I'm very influenced by the group dynamic work of Bion.
Mm,
And I think one of the complicating factors here is at exactly the moment that we need the spaciousness most, it's very likely that the collective anxiety of teams, groups, organizations rises such that some of Bayern's primitive patterns emerge of
mm,
dependency. So we look for the quick solution, we look for the strong leader figure, we're seeing this in politics a lot right now. We see it
mhm,
when we should be addressing the ecological crisis. It's much
mm,
easier to go, let's go for someone who can fix it. And John Alexander was saying yesterday, the message at the moment is essentially, don't worry, uh, I'll control everything, just go shopping. Which,
mm. Yeah,
which
that's
closes down the space at exactly the time we need to open it up. And it happens
yeah.
in companies too. Yeah.
Yes, of
Yeah.
course. And
Yeah.
yes, I don't have a direct in with some of the political leaders, probably thankfully at the moment, but I do like to work with very well-intentioned leaders who are similar to you, Chris, who haven't quite spotted that they are being drawn into the kind of relationship that you're talking about, that they're being tempted into a place of providing some level of certainty when there isn't any, that role of kind of the strong charismatic leader. And I've been in that situation in the simulation back in Ashridge, where all eyes turn to you as the facilitator to make it
Mm.
all fine. And my God, the temptation to step into that is enormous. And I did, and I would have done many times more had you not been at my shoulder going, can you see what's happening here? And so the more that we
Yeah.
might be able to work with people in positions of power to just be aware that that's what happens, and then to have the space where they can choose whether to take that invitation or whether to do something that's quite courageous and hold it open. That's sort of the work that I'm involved in with John.
Yeah. And is it possible to talk about the timing on the book? I mean, is there a like a target date for publication?
That depends whether you talk to
Or
me
is
or
it?
John.
Ah,
Just, I was in a conversation with John and an agent the other day, and John was like, "Yeah, I'm sure we can have a draft in 3 months," and I nearly fell off my chair. So I think that once we get going, we normally, we'll probably write the thing in about 6 months. But with the lead times that they are in publishing, that doesn't mean a book's going to be around anytime soon. So we'll continue with our articles and our other ways of learning and communicating stuff before then. It also very much depends on home situations and mothering teenagers, and whether I get, ironically, the space to write the book on spaciousness. And that is probably the thing that will factor most strongly on when it comes out.
Yeah. So, Megan, we probably in the last few minutes, because we could talk for ages, but we should probably stop at about 40 minutes. Is it fair to, I mean, obviously the book is next, but is it fair to ask you, so what next? I mean, what's looming in on your horizon, things you're interested in?
Do you know, honestly, I haven't cast my attention that far in advance. All I do know is that the spaciousness work is my life work, and it's not like a scientific research project where you're looking to prove a hypothesis and then you run a control group and there you have it, you have your results. Spaciousness is not only a personal journey of my own, but it's also something that there are no answers to. There's no end point. And actually I love that. That's why I work in the field that I do, not because that's not frustrating to me. That just makes it endlessly fascinating. I will never not be learning. I will never have found the answer. There will always be more stuff there. So the role of being energized through curiosity, of being on the edge of comfort, will always drive what I'm doing. So I think we'll probably just continue in our work with spaciousness and continue trying to find ways of bringing it into organizations. That just, it feels like a lot of work. Keep me busy.
Well, no, marvelous. And I think your particular, part of your particular genius in this is that you've taken work, whether it's the mindfulness work or this spaciousness work, which is really difficult in some ways to describe, and it doesn't resolve into 5 points very easily, and you've turned it into books that people love and can take something practical from very quickly. And I think that's credit to you and your co-authors in all of it, because it my answer to it, if go do psychotherapy for 10 years, is not the way that most people can do it. So you're offering something else
but,
for them.
But it's also important to know, for me to notice and for others to notice, that therefore I'm offering very often a stepping stone. I'm not offering the final destination. I mean, our work on spaciousness is an ontological one. At its heart, philosophically, how do we encounter the world around us? How do we perceive our place and role in the world? How can we pay attention to how we're encountering the world? And that is, I mean, I studied that, I suppose, as many people do with PhDs. I studied that over 4 or 5 years. And only at the end of that solid study did I begin to kind of go, oh, I see. So it's not easy work. But there are ways of opening up space, small spaces. And small spaces have a very, very important role and impact within systems, particularly if they're opened up by people in positions of power. And so, yes, our work is kind of a stepping stone or transitionary object, I suppose, towards looking at the much more bigger kind of philosophical question.
Yeah, but I think you're right. I mean, sometimes tiny gestures are really radical acts, and you know, in a world where there is often no time and no space, no room for dialogue, opening up a little can bring a lot of life and a lot of possibility that otherwise just simply is crowded out.
If you can pause at the beginning of a meeting, or if you pause as you put your key in the door as you come back to the family house at the end of the day, if you can pause for just a few moments to bring into awareness how you're showing up, and for that to then influence some little changes that mean that you show up a little bit more curious, a little bit more open, a little bit more empathetic, then that difference can make a huge difference with the people that are around you. So those small spaces are important.
Wonderful. Megan, we could do this for ages. We could do several more episodes, but we will have to stop. Partly because we're on 40 odd minutes, and partly because you need to go to South Africa. So
There is that, yeah.
it's So um, let me close off the episode, and then I'll say a proper thank you to you before we stop recording. So everybody, I hope you've enjoyed this episode of About Time. You will notice there are connections to so many of other of the episodes. I will try to draw some of them out in the notes to this one, and I'll ask Megan to provide us some links to some of her books. We'll make sure that if you want to track her work down, we make it easy for you. Meanwhile, Megan, thank you so much for coming and doing this today, and it's a pleasure, and it's just brilliant as ever to talk.
Thank you, Chris. I honestly have been looking forward to it for quite some time. And there's something incredibly special about having a conversation with you, a colleague of 20 years, and we have been through it together, haven't we? And so it's just lovely to meet and reflect and have that time together. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Have a good, spacious holiday. See you, Megan.
With two
Bye
teenagers.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.